The oil lamp trembles in her hand as she steps barefoot across cold marble. 7 shadows follow her movement along the wall's witnesses, silent and solemn, their faces half hidden in flickering amber light. She's been told this is sacred, that every woman in her family has done this. That to refuse would shatter her father's honor and leave her unmarriageable, abandoned. But no one, not her mother, not the matrons who prepared her ha's, told her what the ritual actually demands. Not until now. Not until the slave pulls back the linen drape and reveals what stands waiting in the corner. Carved from dark wood, anatomically precise, impossibly large, her breath catches. Behind her, someone whispers the god's name. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching this from right now? It amazes me how a ritual from 2,000 years ago can connect us across continents today. Drop a comment and let me know. This is Rome in the year 89 CE, during the reign of Emperor Domitian. The young woman is Flavia Tertia, 18 years old, daughter of a minor equestrian family. 6 hours ago, she was a virgin in her father's house. Now she stands in the atrium of a grain merchant named Marcus Petronius Rufus, a man, 25 years her senior, whom she has met exactly 3 times. The public wedding was beautiful in its way. Saffron veil, 6 braided locks bound with wool, favorable omens read from a sheep's entrails at the temple. Her father signed contracts using formulas older than the Republic itself, transferring legal authority over his daughter to her new husband. She spoke the ancient words every bride speaks. Ubi te Gaius. Ego Gaia where. You are Gaius, I am Gaia. Where you are, I become you. But that ceremony was merely theater for the courts and the gods. What happens here, in this lamplit room with these silent witnesses, is where Roman marriage actually begins. This is where the law requires proof. The procession through the streets had been loud and deliberately obscene. Young men sang fescennine versus graphic, filthy songs describing in anatomical detail what would happen to Flavia tonight. Older women laughed. Children threw walnuts that caught in the folds of her dress, symbols of fertility that felt more like mockery. Her mother had wept while arranging her hair that morning, and her final words had been whispered like a warning. Do not resist. Whatever they require of you, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. At the time, Flavia hadn't understood. Now, standing before the carved figure, she does. The woman guiding her is called a pronuba matron, whose role is to oversee the consummation and testify later if the marriage is ever legally challenged. Her grip on Flavia's arm is firm, almost restraining, as though she expects the girl to bolt. You must greet mutinous Tutunus, the pronuba says quietly. You must ask his blessing before your husband approaches. You must offer yourself as tradition requires. Flavia's hands shake as she reaches for the cloth. The room feels impossibly small despite its size. The physician stands near the wall with his leather bag of instruments. 3 female slaves wait with basins of scented water. Her husband watches from the doorway, his face unreadable in the lamplight. And in the corner, the statue waits beneath its drape. She pulls the linen away. What stands before her is a wooden phallus, carved life-size, no. Larger than life, polished smooth from use, mounted on a pedestal at exactly the height of her hips. This is not a garden amulet meant to ward off evil spirits. This is not a decorative fertility symbol hung above a doorway. This is an instrument designed for a specific, horrifying purpose that becomes undeniable as the pronuba begins positioning her, guiding her body, explaining in clinical terms what the god requires. Here is what almost no one tells you about Roman marriage. It was not primarily a union of hearts or even of families. It was a property transaction, documented and witnessed like the sale of a warehouse or a ship. Roman law classified marriage as conventio, in manima literally coming into the hand, which meant a woman passed from her father's ownership to her husband's. Before the late Republic, this transfer was absolute. A husband held the same legal power over his wife that he held over his slaves, including, theoretically, the right of life and death. By the imperial period, the law had softened slightly. Women could own property under certain conditions. Divorce was possible. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's authority to another's. And like all significant Roman property transfers, it required verification. Think about how Romans handled land sales. Witnesses observed the transaction. Boundaries were walked. The property was inspected to confirm it matched the seller's description. Documents were sealed. Rituals invoked divine blessing, and everyone involved understood precisely what was being exchanged. The Romans applied this exact logic to marriage, with one crucial addition. The bride's primary value lay in her capacity to produce legitimate heirs. Her body was the property being transferred. Her fertility was the resource being purchased. Roman law required both be verified before the transaction could be considered legally complete. This was not interpretation or exaggeration. Roman legal texts state explicitly that a marriage was not valid until consummated, and that consummation had to be confirmed by witnesses, because otherwise, how could anyone be certain it had occurred? The bride's virginity had to be verified, because otherwise, how could the husband be certain any children she bore were his? Each legal requirement generated a corresponding ritual. Rituals that made perfect sense within Roman legal logic. Rituals that horrify us today precisely because that logic is so alien to how we understand marriage, autonomy, and the human body. The god Mutinus Tutunus appears in multiple ancient sources, always briefly, always with visible discomfort. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity was conquering pagan Rome, described the practice with barely contained outrage. Roman brides were required to sit upon the wooden phallus of Mutinus Tutunus before consummation with their husbands, performed in the presence of witnesses as a sacred duty. Augustine was a hostile source, writing to condemn paganism and elevate Christian marriage. But his account matches fragments from earlier non-Christian texts. Lecinus called the ritual so shameful that even naming it pollutes the speaker. Arnobius described brides made to straddle the god's emblem while their new husbands looked on. The antiquarian Varro, writing centuries earlier with no Christian agenda, mentioned Mutinus Tutunus as a deity to whom brides were presented, using language that implied physical contact without describing it directly. Modern historians who address this ritual at all, and many simply ignore it, tend to minimize what happened, suggesting the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic gesture, a fertility blessing no more invasive than throwing rice. But the language of the ancient sources does not support this comfortable interpretation. Augustine's word was inceder, which means to settle onto or mount. Arnobius used language implying penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the details because they were too obscene excessive reaction if someone was merely touching a statue. The stated purpose was divine blessing for fertility. The practical purpose, which Romans may or may not have consciously acknowledged, was preparation, conditioning, breaking down resistance before the real consummation, demonstrating absolute submission before witnesses, making certain the bride understood what her body now was, property, transferred, and verified. Flavia stands frozen. The Pronubus hands guide her closer. The physician watches, waiting to perform his examination afterward. Her husband shifts in the doorway. Nervous himself, he's done this before. Buried one wife already, but the ritual still carries weight. The slaves avert their eyes out of habit, not modesty. And Flavia understands, finally and completely, what her mother's tears meant. What the obscene songs were preparing her for. What being a Roman wife actually requires. She could refuse. Theoretically, Roman law gave her that right, at least on paper. But refusal means disgrace for her family. Nullification of the contracts. Return to her father's house as damaged goods no respectable man would marry. It means everything she's been taught about duty, honor, and womanhood would be proven false, and she would be proven worthless. The choice is not really a choice at all. So she does not refuse. What happens next takes several minutes that feel like hours. The pranuba instructs her in positioning, in movement, in the prayers she must speak while the ritual is performed. The witnesses watch in silence, their role to observe and later testify that tradition was followed, that the gods were properly honored, that the bride submitted as required. The lamp flames waver. Flavia's vision blurs. She focuses on a crack in the marble floor and counts her breaths until the pranuba finally says, "It is done. The god has received you. You may be washed." The slaves come forward with basins of rose-scented water. This washing has religious significance, purification after encountering the divines, but it's also practical preparation for what comes next. The physician approaches. This examination is not optional. Before any wedding involving significant property or status, a respectable Roman bride underwent verification by a physician or midwife to confirm her virginal state. The examination was documented, and the documentation became part of the legal record establishing the bride's value and the marriage's validity. Roman medical texts describe the techniques used with clinical precision that leaves no ambiguity about what was involved. This pre-wedding examination established a baseline. The bride was intact, had never belonged to another man. Now, after the ritual with mutinous tattooiness, the physician performs a second examination to verify the ritual was properly completed, that her physical state is consistent with what the earlier examination established, that she is prepared for consummation with her husband. All of this occurs in the presence of witnesses whose testimony might be required if any aspect of the marriage is ever legally challenged. If the husband later claims the bride was not a virgin, if the wife seeks divorce claiming non-consummation, if inheritance disputes arise over the legitimacy of children, the witnesses provide legal protection for everyone involved. That this protection requires women to endure intimate examination by strangers in semi-public settings is simply the cost of doing business in a civilization built on property law and patriarchal control. What strikes you, reading Roman accounts, is not just the invasiveness, but the casualness. The Romans did not view these rituals as traumatic or problematic. They were simply necessary procedures for accomplishing an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings about being examined, observed, and documented were no more relevant than the feelings of a farm being surveyed before sale. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper procedures, and proper procedures require verification. After the examination, Flavia is led to the marriage chamber. The room has been prepared according to tradition, incense burning. Marriage bed positioned for optimal visibility from the doorway, which will remain open throughout the night. Oil lamps provide sufficient light for the pranuba to observe from her position near the entrance. The slaves who will be needed afterward wait in the corridor. Marcus enters, and Flavia sees he's nervous, which surprises her. She had assumed he would be confident, commanding. Instead, he glances toward the pranuba with something like embarrassment before approaching the bed. The pranuba speaks, her voice formal and ritualistic. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be consummated in accordance with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify the completion. Let no one question that this woman has become a wife. What follows takes hours. The pranuba observes throughout, occasionally providing instruction when necessary, ensuring the consummation is completed in ways that satisfy legal requirements. The door remains open. Sounds carry into the corridor, where slaves wait with more water, more cloths. Everything that happens in that bed is semi-public, part of a verification ritual designed to ensure no aspect of the property transfer can later be disputed. At dawn, the physician returns for a final examination. This confirms consummation occurred. that the bride is now physically changed in ways that mark her transition from virgin to wife. The examination is documented. The pronuba provides formal testimony regarding what she witnessed. The slaves testify they heard sounds consistent with consummation. The legal transformation is complete. Flavia Tirsia is now a Roman wife. She will bear 4 children over the next decade. She will manage her husband's household competently, attend festivals, fulfill all duties expected of a matron of her status. And she will never speak about her wedding night, not even to her own daughters when their marriages are arranged. Because what is there to say? It was tradition. It was how things had always been done. It was what being a Roman wife required. Her silence is not unusual. It is universal. Roman women did not write about their wedding nights. Roman men did not describe what they witnessed in detail. The rituals were so embedded in Roman life that describing them seemed unnecessary, like describing how one breathes. Everyone knew. No one spoke. This is why reconstructing these practices requires piecing together fragments from hostile Christian sources, obscure legal references, embarrassed medical texts, and archaeological evidence that only makes sense when you understand what it was designed for. The silence was not conspiracy. It was the silence of the normalized. These practices were the water Roman women swam in, so omnipresent that describing them felt pointless. For 1,000 years, this was what marriage meant in Rome. Not for everyone. Poor families had simpler ceremonies. Slave unions had no legal standing at all. But for the respectable classes, the families who produced the senators and equestrians and merchants who ran the empire, this was the template. Generations of women experienced their wedding nights within this framework, understood their experiences through this lens, passed their knowledge to daughters in whispers that prepared the next generation without ever explicitly describing what would happen. The system perpetuated itself because everyone involved accepted its fundamental premises. Property must be verified. Transfers must be witnessed. Marriage creates legal obligations requiring documentation. Women are the medium through which families continue. The logic was internally consistent, even as it was externally monstrous. The end came not from internal Roman reform, but from external religious conquest. When Christianity transformed Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, it brought fundamentally different premises. If women had souls equal to men, they could not be treated as property, requiring examination. If marriage was a sacred mystery reflecting Christ's union with the Church, it could not include elements the Church considered obscene. If modesty and privacy were virtues, the entire apparatus of witnesses and verification was offensive to God. The transition took centuries and was never entirely complete. Pagan practices lingered in the countryside long after cities converted. But among educated urban classes, the old ways were systematically suppressed. And the suppression included destruction of evidence. Statues of mutinous Teutonis were smashed or buried in landfills. Texts describing wedding night practices were removed from libraries or allowed to decay. Wall paintings depicting traditional scenes were whitewashed. The pronuba's role was transformed into something purely ceremonial, a matron who held the bride's hand during the ceremony and nothing more. Within a few generations, detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings actually involved was lost to everyone except scholars studying fragmentary surviving sources. The Christians who transformed Rome were not simply erasing embarrassing history. They were trying to build a new civilization on Roman foundations while denying what those foundations had actually supported. They succeeded so well that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage really involved. The comfortable myth of saffron veils and scattered walnuts replaced the uncomfortable reality. But fragments survive. Fragments always survive. Augustine's horrified condemnations, Arnobius's reluctant descriptions, legal texts requiring consummation witnesses, medical manuals explaining examination techniques, archaeological remains of shrines to fertility gods whose worship has no innocent explanation, and thousands of tombstones for women who died young, whose epitaphs call them wife and mother without recording anything else about who they were or what they felt or whether they ever had a choice. Flavia Tirsia died in 131 CE at about 60 after 42 years of marriage. What she felt on her wedding night trauma duty? Resignation, we cannot know. Roman women left no writings. Their experiences were deemed irrelevant to the histories men recorded. Yet the silence reveals why this past was erased. It shows how Rome, foundation of Western law and governance, paired civilization with brutality, legal brilliance with the dehumanization of women. The wedding night rituals are gone, but the women were real. Their humiliation endured unrecorded, and naming it now matters, because silence is how such practices survive.